Joyous Juneteenth to all of you. Whether you are watching from Brooklyn or anywhere around the world, joyous Juneteenth to all of you. Wherever you're watching and however you're watching, thank you for joining us for this BRIC Be Heard Town Hall, Juneteenth, then and now. For all of you who didn't grow up celebrating Juneteenth, myself included, you may be asking yourself, is it a celebration of the end of enslavement for peoples in America? Is it a time to barbecue with your family? Is it a time to read and reflect and consider? Is it a time to attend a Trump rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma? Well, yes to most of those things, but a pretty sharp no to one of them. But however you decided to spend your Juneteenth, we're happy that you're making some time to be in this forum with us. We've met for town halls on previous occasions in our space in the BRIC house, but now we are in your house. So thank you for welcoming us into your space. Juneteenth, then and now. Then could refer to the late 1800s when a group of folks in Galveston, Texas were alerted by some Union soldiers who broke through the Confederacy after the Civil War and finally made their way down to the border towns of Texas to let some formerly enslaved peoples know that the Emancipation Proclamation was in full effect and that they were indeed free of their enslavers. That is one definition of Juneteenth then. Another may be Juneteenth then a year ago before a global pandemic pressed pause on the entire world, or in the more recent future, when a murder of an American citizen, a Black man in Minnesota, set the world on fire and who we are tonight. My name is Brian Vines, and for the next hour, we're going to be in dialogue with some members of our community who don't often get a chance to be in the room together, but we will right now be in that room together virtually with you. So make sure that you're asking questions and commenting and letting us feel you as we make our way through the next hour on the subject of Juneteenth then and now, with a special emphasis on liberation, Black freedom, and Black joy in this time of so much strife. So I'm going to introduce you to those folks with no further ado. First, I'd like to welcome into the room City Council member Cmlauriecumbo. She's a two-term member of the New York City Council and currently serves as the majority leader of the council. She sponsored legislation to create the first ever citywide minority and women-owned business task force, and she's joining us from her home right now. Thank you for being here, Councilmember Cumbo.
Always.
I'm also happy to have Rosa Clemente with us this evening. Rosa is an organizer, a political commentator, as well as being an independent journalist and the first, let history show, Afro-Latina woman to run for vice president of the United States back in 2008 on the Green Party ticket. And she is a doctoral candidate. So soon we'll have to call you Dr. Clemente, but tonight we're happy to have you on your path. Thank you for joining us, Rosa.
Thank
and
you.
I'm turning now to Robert Ganji. Bob Ganji's been an activist and a community organizer, as well as a public policy advocate in New York City for over 4 decades. He served as the executive director of the Correctional Association for over 29 years before founding the Police Reform Organizing Project, PROP, where he serves as the executive director. Thanks for joining us, Bob.
Happy to be part of it.
And rounding out our 4 for the evening is Olympia Soudan, a Bed-Stuy raised Afro-Latinx Asian trans woman who is an author, a healer, a poet, and the co-director of the Blacktransmedia, an organization dedicated to reframing the value and worth of Black trans people by building community, media, education for racial and gender justice. So that is our group for tonight. And the unseen force in the room is you, of course. So please do continue to comment as if we were in the room like we get together at Brick House, and let us feel you and pose your questions and share your comments with your community here as we get through this next hour in celebration, commemoration, and the spirit of Juneteenth. So looking at all of your faces, knowing that we've been going through it for the last few hundred years, as well as in the immediate future that we've been facing right now, we know that there's some rough things going on. But like I said at the top, we want to make space for Black joy and excellence and exuberance on Juneteenth. So things might get heavy, but we know that all of you have reason to celebrate every day and give us reasons to be happy to be in your community. So the first thing that I just want to start off by asking each of you is this notion of anti-Blackness that so many people have just woken up to, if they have the privilege to have not realized it before. I wonder how anti-Blackness shows up in your respective fields of endeavor and how it's affected the world up until now for those who may not have realized it. I'll start with you, Rosa. You're working in the education space, which is fundamental. So how has anti-Blackness shown up historically and presently?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, let's just thank all the young people. You know, if we want to talk about joy, if many of us as organizers are not fully seeing what's happening, as a trained historian, I am full of joy today. You know, my daughter's 15. She's out on the streets right now at a rally, you know, while I'm here, and that we can all contribute in any way we can. But as far as it goes around anti-Blackness, for me, anti-Blackness is, you know, global. Wherever we are as a Black diasporic people, as people taken from the continent and dispersed all around the world, anti-Blackness is always showing up. But I think it is a good conversation to have, especially around ethnicity and us as like Black and brown folks, and how we as Black Puerto Ricans or Afro-Latinx people deal with our anti-Blackness, you know, and what that can mean. With that being said, I really just encourage people, especially in the Black and brown community, because I've actually seen some discussions that are making me kind of cringe, where people are saying, well, all Latinx people are anti-Black. And you're like, the system's anti-Black, you know? Blackness is around the corner here in Albany, New York, but that we have a shared legacy of resistance, and not to ever just see ourselves from the moment of colonization, but what it was before and what it is now.
I'm looking at you now, Councilmember Cumbo, from the sort of cultural standpoint and the halls of power as well, two of your dual careers, from being in that creative space to being in a legislative body. How has anti-Blackness manifested on those fronts?
I would say founding MOCADA, the Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora and Arts, 20 years ago, the concept and the idea, recognizing that Brooklyn had one of the largest populations of people of African descent, but did not have a museum where that art and history and culture could be celebrated, collected, and to serve communities of people that live right here in Brooklyn, but also globally. And just the concept of that was really seen for people as something that should remain small. You should start with something really small, and it should be small. And this concept of a constant, you know, how are you going to build a museum? How are you going to fund it? You should do a little something, or do a program or a project. And it was like really having to fight through that, and recognizing that something grander that is more in keeping and in alignment with who we are as an African diaspora people. And I remember coming to really terms in terms of systemic racism that's like written in stone. The first grant that I wrote was to the New York State Council for the Arts. And they have a film department, a dance department, a museum department, and you would apply for the grant that you would want it in those prospective categories. So I picked the museum category. That's where I knew I fit. And I remember the director at the time said, why don't you fill out the form for the Ghetto Arts program? And I said, excuse me, the Ghetto Arts program? And she was like, you didn't see it on the website? And I was like, you mean you actually call it that? Like it's written in a website, that particular division? And she was like, because the type of art that you want to show our panel is not going to be prepared to review that type of art. So you should apply to the Ghetto Arts Fund, and you probably would be supported through that. So I went through all kinds of like changes in terms of, I'm not applying to that. I'm not applying. And finally, she was a sister. She was like, if you don't apply, you're not going to get the money. Right. So I humbled my little self, wrote the money to the Ghetto Arts program, got the funding, and continued in that realm for a number of years. But those were the types of ways that you had to minimize yourself in order to receive funding. And that's something that's across the board. I just want to say, in the city council, Councilmember Moya just introduced and passed legislation to abolish the word alien from all city documents, anything that pertains to anything referring to our immigrant community and referencing them as aliens. And this is really important because we as a people are known as minorities, when in actually we are the majority. And the nonsensicalness of us calling ourselves minority is seen when people say we have minority majority communities. I mean, we have to see ourselves as the majority, and the minority and the majority can change where you are based and where you are located. In New York City, people of color are the majority, and we should refer to ourselves as those things. And when you change the language, people change how they see themselves. But people have thought for so long that it was critical that we see ourselves as minorities in order to limit our power. So that was my first experience in the arts. In the political world, I could go on for the whole entire panel. So I'll add on to that in other jewels that I can drop when answering questions.
Well, speaking of language and the way that we cast ourselves and see ourselves, I'm looking at you now, Olympia, as someone who understands the power of the media. Can you share an example of when you felt the power of anti-Blackness rear its head in your professional endeavors?
Yeah, I feel like I experience anti-Blackness every day as a Black person, just living. And it also brings me to the point as to why Blacktransmedia was founded and why we work on Blacktransmedia. And there's a lot of Black trans people here in New York City as Black trans leaders working in different movements, but don't have a specific organizing space. Or if there are spaces within the city that offer that resource, it is not safe and it is not accessible to our folks. So Blacktransmedia was created to shift and reframe the value and worth of Black trans people. And also brings me to another point. I'm not sure if folks have done the anti-oppression training, the 4 Eyes of Oppression. And we talk about how oppression moves through 4 channels, being internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and ideological. And so while some institutions right now might say they care about Black life, what are their interpersonal relationships, like with Black people specifically, that are working towards shifting that and shifting those ideologies specifically to drive their work to combat anti-Blackness, and also just think about most of our work home in our communities and other spaces are dominated by white supremacist ideologies of who we should be as Black people and Black trans people.
Thank you for that. So, Bob, I'm looking at you and thinking about this notion of anti-Blackness, and I'm sure that you have examples from your 40 years in activism here in New York. But just an addendum to the question before you even give us an example, I wonder, do white people have conversations about anti-Blackness like Black people do?
Yes, and most of the white people in my social circle are liberal politically. They all voted for Obama, for example. But a number of the white people in my social circle, people who are my friends, don't fully understand. I mean, I work on criminal justice issues. I work on prison issues. I worked on prison issues. Now I'm working on policing issues. And a number of the white people who I talk to about these issues, particularly older white people, I'm old, I'm in my 70s, don't fully appreciate the divide between, for example, how police relate and react to white people as opposed to how police relate and react to Black people. And so that's a harsh reality, and it's also a political challenge in terms of convincing more and more people just how brutally racist our criminal justice system is, what our prison system is, and policing in the United States. And I think everybody in the panel knows this. What we've seen in the last 3 weeks in terms of the videos exposing just how brutal and racist policing is, I mean, starting with the murder of George Floyd, and then the videos in New York City and across the country of police officers just engaged in this aggressive kind of violence. That's if you didn't know that that's so much of how the cops operate on a daily basis, could be shocking. So racism and anti-Blackness is rooted deeply, unfortunately, in our country, and I think is expressed most aggressively and most brutally by policing, by our criminal justice system. And it starts with policing, but it carries throughout. It's the jails, it's the way district attorneys operate, it's the way our prisons operate. And this moment, because you talked, Brian, about having this moment be celebratory and this day be celebratory, what we potentially can celebrate is how I think more effectively than any time in my life, and again, I'm an old man in my 70s, has the brutality and the racist nature of the system, I'm not talking about the criminal justice system and policing, been exposed since the murder of George Floyd. And that I think more and more people are aware of it. More and more people are taken to the streets, including white people. And it's going to be harder. Whenever we've had these kind of uprisings before, when we had all the turmoil the summer of 2014 around the death of Michael Brown at the hands of police, the death of Eric Garner on the hands of police, caught on video, and eventually the movement, although enrolled a lot of people and exposed the problem, fell short of any significant gains, any significant changes. All the kind of tweaks around the edges, the kind of things that and I'm a fan of Obama, that Obama talked about, the kind of things that de Blasio's talked about, Cuomo's talked about, the kind of things that were instituted in Minneapolis, tweaks around the edges, body cameras, implicit bias training, right. Banning the use of chokeholds. All those things are superficial. And we won't get to the fundamental change that's needed to root out the racism, to root out the violence, unless we have significant change. And that significant change will take the form of the banner that's being waved now is called Defund Police. In New York, it's Defund the NYPD. Right. The need to cut the power of police departments and the funding of police departments. That's the issue of the moment.
So can I ask you...
the anti-Blackness.
Well, Bob, you invoked defund the police, and we've got a lot of questions about that in anticipation of this conversation. And I just wondered from each of you, and maybe I'll start with you, Councilmember because the New York City Council has taken up an effort to reduce the NYPD's budget. I wonder what's the working definition of defund the police? Because if you ask 3 people, you hear 4 different things, but what is the framework that the New York City Council is using to defund the NYPD?
Well, the New York City Council, led by Speaker Corey Johnson, have put forth our budget proposal to the mayor in terms of what cutting $1 billion could do, in terms of how we could redirect that money. And essentially what that means is that money will be redirected into other agencies, or other agencies like school safety or others would be redirected back to the DOE. So this sort of exercise is an important one, but I think to Bob's point, defunding the NYPD is important symbolically also because it starts to recognize that we are shifting the power away from the NYPD into empowerment for communities of color. Now, symbolically, that's the right way to go. But at the same time, while we're talking so much about defunding, defunding does not improve, as you spoke about, Bob, in terms of systematic racism within the NYPD. It doesn't provide the cure for how we recreate a new NYPD. So I feel like it's important equally at the same time of discussing defunding or redirecting funding from the NYPD, that we also equally talk about and spend just as much energy in terms of how do we dismantle a racist NYPD system that was really designed to uphold the original sin of slavery, in terms of, although we had Juneteenth and we had the Emancipation Proclamation, there were still clauses that existed that stated that people that are in our prison systems can be utilized for the purposes of free servitude. And that was the clause that made people accept the fact that slavery as we know it was ending, because those clauses were in place. And those clauses could have anything to do with, if you were preaching a sermon and you didn't get the right permit, you could be arrested. If you were unemployed, you could be considered a vagrant and be arrested. This idea of arresting was to fuel the continuation of a free labor system that still continues to this day. So I think it's really important.
Actually, with the full knowledge that that system is woven into the system that we have now, Rosa, I know you've spent a large chunk of your energy and organizing momentum around an idea of abolishment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel the police should be abolished. First, I trust in our communities that we can come up with ways to keep our communities safe. Secondly, like, I think defunding the police is a very interesting conversation, particularly in Washington, D.C., where they co-opted that to the point that we have now some Democratic mayors of cities saying we actually want more money for the police and things like that. So, yeah. And I think also when we say abolish the police, you know, the vision is there and it's also there on paper, you know, and I live in upstate New York. I'm in Albany, New York. I'm 1 mile away from the governor's mansion. And we've seen 2 tanks in the streets of Albany because of 4 days of gun violence. And we have a woman mayor, we have a Black DA, we have a Black chief of police, we have a Latina who's the human rights commissioner. And what the police in Albany are doing is straight like military tactical warfare on a very small community that's in one area. You know, like you'll hear the helicopters coming over here soon. And that's what we've been faced with. So I also think in this, we also talk about how can we have restorative justice when someone causes harm to someone else? If we know that most people who are incarcerated, like in the state of New York, are there for nonviolent felonies, there's a way to have restorative justice, because when we get brothers and sisters and non-gender conforming people that come out, there's no re-entry services. We have more people on probation and parole that are incarcerated, 4.5 million people. Those people on parole or probation know. And that's actually what happened in the Rashard Brooks case. If you saw the interview that he did a couple months before he was murdered, he talked about coming out and how there were no services. He was a nonviolent felon, credit card fraud. And that, for me, when I saw that, I was like, this is why he ran away. Because he knew he was about to be violated. And also, like, he saw George Floyd, and also there were like 30 people on the Wendy's line. And I'm sure something in his mind was like, well, let me just run. You know, they had his car, they had his license, and we know what happened. So I think, you know, now is the time to envision the future that we want. We might not get there, at least while I'm alive. It might get there when my daughters are alive, but we have to disband all of it. Like anything around criminal justice or mass incarceration, it has to go. I mean, I know we have council people like Councilwoman Combo and Councilwoman Inez Barron that got our back, you know, but I also know that they fought very hard around Rikers Island being closed. And what was the solution? To build 5 newer, more nice looking detention centers in each borough. And I actually probably, Councilwoman will let us know when it'll probably be like, no, we're going to shut it down and try to get some of these people mostly into reentry services or restorative justice programs. So yeah, I'm about abolishing the system of policing. It has not worked. It's rooted in catching people who wanted to be free, enslaved Africans in this country. It's off on a shaky foundation, and that's why we're here now.
Olympia, I see you nodding in agreement there. And anyone who's paid any attention know that Black transgender people bear a disproportionate burden of police violence, but also face higher rates of violence just living their lives, walking in our streets.
Ashe. And I will also say, also on top of that, the erasure. I'm thinking about Tony McDade in Tallahassee, Florida, who was killed by the police, and people are not saying his name, I think, enough. I also think about when we're talking about the police, the origins and the roots of police, like Rosa was just sharing, is like slave patrol, catching people who were freed or supposed to be in service or in servitude in this particular way. I also think about recently there was a rally at Stonewall for Tony McDade, the Black trans man from Tallahassee, and Nita Pop from Missouri. And I was asking the crowd that was yelling, defund the police and reform. And for me, I'm like, defund for how long? And reform until when? Like, when will these pillars of oppression for community, these law and orders, processes, be restorative and transformative in what they are seeking out and they're practicing as well. I also think there has been a legacy of us resisting and also using practicing accountability rather in our communities outside of the police. And Bob, you were talking about like, there hasn't been much change since Obama, and like the things that have been moving forward in terms of the body cams are not enough. And I think it is enough because it has gotten us here. It is enough because we're still organizing. It is enough because we're still gonna use this moment to burst into the future, into our Black futures, our Black trans futures. So I definitely think that there is a reframing that I feel like should be uplifted, and that is abolition, thinking and having conversations around accountability, but not attached or rooted in these carceral practices, knowing that America is one of, or the most carceral country in the world, and that is dangerous.
So we have a question that came in about what is the biggest institutional hurdle to police prison abolition, and what steps can individuals and organized groups take to expedite the process?
The biggest obstacle is political, and it's not just the typical enemies of significant change like the police unions or the right wing. Nationally, I think it's different locally in New York, where you have politicians like Councilmember Cumbo coming out for the $1 billion cut, but Joe Biden has called for actually increasing the funding for policing in the country. Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, the bill that they proposed would actually significantly increase the resources for district attorneys. And there are specific ways to cut the power and funding of the NYPD and move toward an abolitionist vision. And I think we should be talking about that. And I'll just quickly go down them because I think people could understand them. We don't need a vice squad. The vice squad in New York Police Department is notorious for violating the rights of sex workers and violating the physical well-being of sex workers. We should decriminalize sex work in New York City. We should get, Councilmember Cumbo talked about, we should get the police out of the schools, return the responsibility for school safety to the Division of Education. We should disband the gang unit within the NYPD, which is basically a mean to target Black and Latino young people in New York City. We should disband something called the peddler squad. In New York City, for some reason that I don't think anybody could explain, it's the NYPD who regulates street vendors, and they often do it in a very punitive way. We should take that power away from them. So there are very specific ways to take away from the police department. We should, for example, another one, there's a homeless outreach program. The NYPD cops shouldn't be doing homeless outreach. It should be social workers. It should be mental health specialists. NYPD is the first responders when a call comes into 911 that there's an emergency in the community involving a New Yorker in psychiatric crisis. The people who should respond to New Yorkers in emotional distress should be mental health professionals, should be mediation specialists. They're very specific policy-oriented ways that I think a lot of the public, when it's presented to them, could understand that should not be the responsibility of the NYPD, should be the responsibility of community-based organizations or government agencies where the people who work for the community-based organizations or the government agencies have the training, have the vocation, have the desire to help people. Most people become police officers not because they want to be social workers. Another corollary point is some people become police officers because, whether consciously or not, they know it's going to be a job where they could put into real practice their sadistic and racist tendencies. So to get to the way we could curb and eliminate abusive policing and racist policing is by cutting the power, cutting the funding, cutting the personnel, cutting the duties. Be very, very specific. And getting back to the political moment in New York City, the $1 billion cut that's being proposed by the city council leadership, that's a significant change. That is not just a superficial tweaking around the edges. And it's very important that the city council hold firm and push on this and impose on de Blasio to accept that cut. That would be a meaningful step down the road toward significant change, and would mean that George Floyd and all the other Black people, all the other Black and brown people who've been killed for no good reason by police officers did not die in vain.
Bob, can I throw a concept to you to what you're talking about, and would love for everybody to just weigh in on this briefly. One of the things or concepts that I thought about was a community service training aspect of it too, because I also believe that there has to be some ways in terms of reforming or creating more community peacemakers or peacekeepers, if you will. If we start to see our police department more as peacekeepers instead of a policing agency. But the goal would be to we have in the New York City Council an initiative called Theaters of Color, Black, Latino, Asian, and Native American organizations throughout the 5 boroughs. These organizations, my goal would be to have the police officers do, and these numbers are negotiable, of course, 30 hours of community service prior to entering the academy, 30 hours during, and 30 hours after, and annually continuously doing 30 hours of community service. This way, those organizations that are in our communities, people of color, well entrenched within their neighborhoods, could train the officers, but also their evaluation would play a role in the rubric in terms of how the officers move throughout the training program. So if, let's say, there are 5 points, this point would be a point in terms of if you even enter the academy, and it would empower the community-based organizations in order to say who can and who cannot enter into their community to be peacekeepers, but it would also give them real world experience. It's like the type of thing, very quickly, if you go on a vacation and you go to stay with a family that lives in that community where you're going on this vacation versus if you go on a cruise ship. And I feel like our police academy gets the cruise ship training of how to work within our communities versus staying with the community, developing those relationships, and that community having a say as to who comes into their community through the evaluation process. And those organizations would have that NYPD funding redirected into not-for-profit organizations. And these type of organizations are like the National Black Theater, Billie Holiday Theater, and many others that have been doing the work for decades.
So Olympia, let me hone the council member's question a little bit. What would that time spent with these officers, what would 30 hours look like for you that you would want every person who puts on a uniform to know before they come into your community as a peacekeeper?
That's right.
I think that there will be a lot of resistance. I, for myself, will just be triggered, I think, throughout the process because of the nature and the history of police. I think the divestment of police should be just that, and there is an investment of existing community groups that are already practicing community accountability. I think that that would be a way. One of the ways also that police can do it is go through that educational process, that historical process as to what the police is, right? And internally have those conversations about what they can do to contribute to abolition as a whole. I think this system has not been working, and I myself, I'm not really so interested in polishing what I think is a violent system and a violent institution, the police. So I'm interested more in going into communities and figuring out how are we developing together transformation and restorative processes that don't have to look like the police. And I do think the accountability or peacekeepers could be a name for community members to hold as their just practicing accountability. I also wanted to say, in terms of your previous question about like how can we work past the hurdles to abolition, and is that definitely genuinely addressing the anti-Blackness in this country, as well as changing the narrative in the media. The media has constantly been one of the driving forces that instill the fear in the people and tell the people who to fear, what is going on. And I feel like that's one of the ways. Also, educating our communities about the ways we've historically stayed safe, the ways that communities are staying safe now, and also space for us to vision about what we feel safety is, because that looks different for different people. And I just think the larger system that policing reflects is just a militaristic.
So can I pull on that thread for just a moment? Olympia, you brought up some really great points. And I just want to, as a body, ask everyone, looking at the totality of where we are right now, knowing that we came together to talk about this and vision ourselves into an idea of Black freedom, is criminal justice system the linchpin or the sort of entry point into the greatest, broadest space for Black freedom? Or what is it? Is it, once we solve criminal justice, that's the beginning of really realizing Black freedom? From each of your perspectives, where does that freedom lie? Is that the path, or is it education? Is it creative expression, economic empowerment? If you had to select one sort of point of entry for real, even healthcare, as we sit here in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, what is that entry point for Black freedom in 2020?
It's not the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is, the racism is so longstanding, so deeply entrenched. That's the point of the people calling for abolition. I'm not totally signed on to abolition, but I'm signed on to significant change. One of you made the reference that the NYPD was founded in 1845. And this notion that the police departments are supposed to serve and protect, that's public relations crap. I mean, the NYPD was founded in 1845 in part to control two populations that were considered unruly. One, recent Irish immigrants, the irony being in a couple decades after that, Irish ethnic groups took over and basically ran the police department, and Black people. Freed Black people in New York City because New York State had abolished slavery in 1827. So the purpose of the NYPD and of every police department established in large urban jurisdictions in our country has always been, at least in part, to control and contain, and in some ways in brutal, violent fashions, marginalized groups and Americans of color. So the point that I think we're all saying, I think there's a common theme, is to give Black people and other people of color and other marginalized groups, trans people, sex workers, street vendors, homeless people, people in psychiatric distress, to give them a better quality of life and to give them freedom, we need to limit the impact of the NYPD and the criminal justice system on their lives. And we need to, for example, to Councilmember Cumbo's point, I would not want to have peacekeepers working with the NYPD because of how entrenched and longstanding the racism is and the tendency toward violent, lawless conduct. There are organizations, there's an organization called, and I think probably all of you heard of it, it's called the Cure Violence Organization, where they have on their staff people called credible messengers. The credible messengers are people who themselves had either been gang members or had been in and out of prison, and they've come out of that experience committed toward being productive citizens and law-abiding citizens, and they work with the young people in their communities to divert them from whatever appeal getting involved in criminal lifestyle has for them. And those programs have been documented as
So Bob, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to jump in just out of respect for time, because I know that Rosa, you want to say something, because I want to get at this notion of freedom.
Yeah, no, for me, we have to, freedom will happen when we abolish capitalism, right? That's what a lot of us are not talking about, right? First of all, a lot of us on this call, me included, we're privileged right now. We can work from home and get a paycheck, all right? Most of the brothers and sisters can't do that, including my husband, who's a custodian and had to be in hot spots cleaning them while this crisis is happening on a college campus. So this is where I have to elevate the conversation. The reason, right, there's so many cops in the mass transit system in New York, why would you care if somebody's not paying $2.50 to get on a subway home? Because you're incentivized, whether by getting a bigger paycheck like the cop who killed Garner, you're incentivizing capitalism at that point. And we're not having, a lot of us are not having that discussion, where globally, everybody's having that discussion. Let's just look at the COVID crisis here in New York State. Right. Has Andrew Cuomo been great as a Democratic governor? Yes. And he sucks on everything else. He cut Medicaid, he closed hospitals, he works with gentrification organizations, real estate PACs, and all of that. Here we are in New York State, where we have the most Democratic Black and brown officials ever, up and down. And look at the crisis in New York State just around the economy. So I would say we have to start talking about how we end the system of capitalism. What does it look like to redistribute wealth? What does it look like to support cooperative economics that in hand can work from people that are incarcerated? And, I like, even in the parole system here in New York, or probation, these brothers and sisters and non-gender conforming people, the minute they come out, they have to pay a fee. Like, why? They did their time for smoking weed, and now they have to spend 2 or 3 years on the parole and probation and paying all those fees. So yeah, it's capitalism, but also the duopoly of the electro-political project, right? Like, where we're at right now, we got to get Trump out. And I'm with Movement for Black Lives that say Trump has to resign. All right, that's where the young people are. I'm supporting them. But like you mentioned earlier, Joe Biden hasn't been a friend to Black and brown people pretty much ever until the last year, where he has to make his amends. And lastly, I would encourage people to really think, why all of a sudden are all these corporations saying Black Lives Matter, like Amazon, but firing Black workers for organizing for better wages and free healthcare and sick leave? We're not stupid. And we have to just be on point and say, what does society look like when we're not about the almighty dollar? Like, that's where I think it all stems from. These are all byproducts of capitalism. So that system needs to be broken and smashed,
Councilmember, I saw you co-signing on what Rosa was saying, especially with respect to workers. And I know there was some legislation in the city council who were protecting people from speaking up about COVID-related things that they were witnessing on their jobs, to be free from fear of retribution there. But is is the legislation the key to freedom? What is the entry point for freedom as we see it now in 2020?
I mean, I would say that legislation is a big part of it because you can't always change the hearts and minds of people. So the law is one tool in terms of creating the type of equality or necessity that's called for, particularly at that particular point in time. It's also the exercise of legislation as well, like what was referred to, Bob was talking about in terms of, things that we're doing on the fringes. Sometimes you can only do what you can do at the moment and hope that the exercise of the fringe, because if you can believe it, there was a huge amount of debate in a body of 48 council members who are Democratic that we had to go hours and weeks over the chokehold ban. So, it's one of those things where you have to take the exercise and the time to educate people to get that super majority vote. Like there was a lot of hand twisting and there was a lot of things just to get people to understand the change. We also talked in the city council that we're going to be huge mental change for people in terms of the things that they've held on to that form their identity. And so systems, but takes time. So, some people will say, oh, they're going to make Juneteenth a holiday. Oh, writing Black Lives Matter on the street. Those are fringe things that don't really matter. But for a people that have been told that they can't do almost anything, the act and the art of just being able to take a statue down, to write the Black Lives Matter, there are steps in the right direction that are getting people to say, I have power, I have a voice. And the more they exercise that and the more they see that, their appetite for it, they're going to want more. So I don't think legislation is the only aspect to changing this, but it is a tool of many tools. The young people, as Rosa talked about, out in the streets, that's the number one tool. Because we were trying to pass the chokehold bill for 5 years following the death of Eric Garner. Those young people out in the street made something that couldn't happen all of a sudden happen. We've been trying to remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson for 5 years. Those young people are out in the street. We got it done. It happened. The discussion of $1 billion cutting it was like, oh my God, you can never do that. The young people out in the street gave us the power and the tools to be able to do that. And I would say on an every single night basis, I'm trying to figure out what more we can get while these young people are out there, because us older ones that are getting up there have to execute their vision, because they've said we don't want to inherit this society you've given us. We want a better one, and we're changing it right now.
Absolutely. Speaking of that execution of vision and the change right now, I'm still waiting to hear from you, Olympia, about what that vision of freedom would look like for you and the members of your community right now in 2020.
I definitely, thank you so much, Brian. I definitely see it as stages in terms of education. So like in terms of legislation, we need to have people that are educated and are not moving from a place of prejudice, of violence, preconceived ideas about Black people, poor people, disabled people, thinking about that, because there are people that are upholding these laws. I also think about like, Rosa, you mentioned capitalism. For a lot of Black trans people, we're making less than $15,000 a year. So there's a relationship that we need to have that it just needs to have in order for us to have a relationship, of course, to sustainability and our longevity. I really think it is about investing in community groups that have already been doing this work, as well as educating people on all levels, citywide, state levels, people who are, in city official positions that are holding power differently than people who are not in those positions. And I feel like ultimately might not have those connections to community in a way that will help them address these issues with an intersectional lens, which is really important. And we're missing that across the humans, I believe. And also just making sure that you're supporting things like what we have going on, like the Reclaim Pride Coalition, who announced the Queer Liberation March for Black Lives Against Police Brutality, Sunday, June 28th, at Foley Square at 1 p.m. So things like that, movements that you can be a part of, definitely help to push that conversation that much closer to what it is that we feel we need and want in our bodies, for our bodies as Black people.
I love the way Olympia drops her event right in the middle of her speech.
Well, you know what we're doing at Foley.
That's how we do it.
That's how we do.
So you all have your marching orders. The 28th, we'll see you at Foley Square. But
That's
thinking
right.
of that momentum that each of you touched on, and that push that a council member like Cmlauriecumbo needs to enact this legislation is one path. I'm wondering how each of you feels we can move this moment forward and leverage this energy that we've never seen before, with us moving in one accord. If you hashtag Blue Lives Matter, you get Korean kids popping up, disrupting the whole algorithm, trying to show that Black Lives Matter, inserting it back into the conversation. So I'm going to start with you, Olympia. How do we leverage this moment and keep the momentum going? And what does a win look like? How do we know that we've achieved the liberation when we're only been here for 30 days, knowing full well that the bus boycott down in Alabama took over a year? How long do we have to go, and how do we use this momentum?
I definitely see, as for myself, every day that there is life, that I'm granted life with the power of the ancestors, is definitely a win in a lot of ways. I also think there's a power of working across different communities, across the things that we are aligned on, whether it is abolishing this whole system, whether it is the anti-capitalism and imagining whether we're trading or bartering, and also just uplifting spaces, as I mentioned before, that are all about that imagination, that vision, that action, that work. But most importantly, I think we'll definitely go into educating folks about our history. What is it that we are coming from? What is it that we want? Is it something that requires us to build something out of new? Or are there things that we can take with us on this journey to the future that will help us because it's rooted in our history?
Yeah, and I think now that we're talking about Juneteenth, I think I'm a trained historian, so I see the long picture in all of this, right? So obviously we have the Emancipation Proclamation and what that meant. We have Reconstruction. So then in 1912, right, 1921, excuse me, it'll be 100 years next year. It's 99 this year. You have a community that's thriving, that goes through a racial genocidal massacre, right? And in fact, I was interviewing Robin DJ Kelly, that everybody should know. He's probably our foremost historian, where he was telling me yesterday that people don't talk about the 2 days after the racial massacre, where they had interned the brothers and sisters who were surviving, who had survived. So I think it's important that we say right now, first and foremost, I'm an organizer. So first and foremost, we're winning some things. That is critically important. I don't think that taking down statues and all of that are just symbolic. Like, there's no other country that elevates slaveholders and genocidal maniacs, right? And third, that right now we're dealing with a megalomaniac in office, right? And a COVID crisis, which has really brought young people to the streets. I think they would have been out there anyway at this moment because the killing of George Floyd was so visceral. But yeah, we have to kind of look at the long trajectory of history. So right now we're like climbing up the struggle and the liberation ladder. If there ends up being an ebb and flow, then what does that mean to always continue to resist? As an organizer, you're always going to find an opportunity to organize. You're always, also for younger people, they need to see us as people that have their back. You know, I'm 48. I may not be on the streets every day, but my daughter is. But also, what is it that young people are asking for us to do, which is support them. Don't talk down to them. And lastly, yes, since Ferguson, I think it's important for people to remember that Ferguson had 367 days, a year and 2 days of everyday protests. And why Ferguson is a historical marker is because at that moment, you had all these young Black and brown people that had voted for Obama, that thought Trayvon Martin's killer would be convicted. And when all of that went apart, they were like, yo, we have to rise up. And they rose up in a military state that was in Ferguson, you know, and that also brought the intersectionality that we see now, particularly around Black, trans, and Black, queer, non-gender conforming people of color who are disproportionately being murdered by police, but by others in our communities.
So, Mr. Ganji, we're coming up on our last 2 minutes. One of those is yours, and one will be Councilmember Cumbo's when we get her reconnected. But 1 minute on how we know that we're going to get there and what the end result looks like.
Very Solomonic of you, Brian. A minute up for each of us. The thing that I am and my organization PROP, and I think other people working on police reform in New York City are most focused on is what we've talked about, that $1 billion cut. $1 billion cut in the NYPD budget, $1 billion, will be a significant step and will send a message to the NYPD, you no longer rule the city the way you have for decades in effect. And it will send a message to the community that the NYPD is on the ropes or potentially on the ropes. And talking about rallies, I think we should all show up on June 28th at Foley Square. There's going to be a rally this coming Tuesday, June 23rd at 5 o'clock in front of City Hall. And the main part of the agenda of that rally is to put pressure on City Hall and the City Council to cut that budget by at least $1.1 billion. That would represent significant progress that we still have to build on, but that would be an important breakthrough.
So breakthroughs all around. We thank you, each of you, for being here. Councilmember Cumbo, we've run up against your time, but we'll be watching you on the city council hearings that are taking place live on Zoom and sharing that momentum. We thank each of you for being here. So in our last 30 seconds,
this is my reality right here.
Hey, this is the reality. This is how we're all living.
Exactly.
You talked about this Black joy.
Like.
I know there's a joyful little boy who's responsible for all of that. And that's right, the same energy that we're going to take forward into the rest of this movement.
It was a good note to show on.
See you at our next town hall.
All right, thank you everybody.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Brian, and everybody. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Everybody.